is, isn't it? Yeah. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? I'm very delighted to be here tonight to talk to you during Asia Week on the occasion of our renovation of our Korean gallery at the MFA Boston, which was opened in mid-November. So I moved to the MFA Boston in September 2008 from the British Museum, and I was delighted to find there that not only did we have a great Korean ceramics collection, but also some wonderful Buddhist paintings, which have not been on view for many years. And the Korean gallery renovation this year, well, last year now actually, followed the installation of the South and Southeast Asian Gallery in 2011. And they're both the first steps in a plan we have to renovate all the Asian galleries one by one as we can obtain funding for them. So here you can see a map of Korea. I'm sure most of you are experts on Korea and don't need to be told where Korea is, but there are some people who do get Korea muddled up, and it's a curious fact that some people still think that Korea is in Southeast Asia when it's actually in Northeast Asia, as we know. And I expect you all know that Korea, the shape of the Korean peninsula is often compared to a rabbit. You can see the shape of the rabbit with the ears at the top and the paws. And then here are some important dates, which I'm sure most of you know. Korea was divided into 3 kingdoms in the early times, and then it was sort of unified in AD 668, and then it was colonized by Japan in 1910 to 1945. And since the Korean War, it's remained divided, North and South Korea, as a result of the truce in 1953. So the war's not officially over. Now, the MFA Boston was founded in 1870. The same year, actually, as the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And early in its history, Asian art became one of its strengths. It was a leader in the field. And some of the most interesting items in the Korean collection are a group of 60 photographs taken in 1882 to 1883 by a local Bostonian, Percival Lowell. And you can see Percival Lowell here on the right-hand side of this photograph there. His dates were 1855 to 1916. I expect you all know that Korea had been called the Hermit Kingdom on the basis that Westerners had long been forbidden on pain of death of entering the country. But in 1882, diplomatic relations were established between Korea and the USA. That's 130 years ago now. And Lowell had the remarkable experience of being the escort for 10 members of Korea's first diplomatic mission to the United States via Japan in 1883. And here you can see him with that mission, which of course included Yu Gil-jun. And then in December 1883, Lowell was invited to Korea by the Emperor Jeong. And the photographs of Korea taken by Lowell, who was a descendant of a prominent Boston Brahmin family, are of great historical significance, and they poignantly record that period during the very closing days of the Choson Dynasty, when Korea had just opened up to the West and had not yet been forcibly colonized by Japan. So there are numerous scenes like this of Old Seoul, which were taken by Lowell during the time he stayed in Korea. And they're now in the MFA collection. And they're a window onto Lowell's time as an intimate of Emperor Jeong, of whom he was uniquely allowed to take photographs of him sitting in Gyeongbok Palace. So Lowell spent a decade in Asia, and he wrote a book called Choson, Land of the Morning Calm, in 1886. And he later, as you may know, became an astronomer and founded the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. So the MFA Boston really has a remarkably early history of contact with Korea. Now, Japan had opened up to the West in the 1860s, and as a result of this, it was ironically due to a famous trio of Gilded Age Bostonians and their fascination with Japan that the Korean collection at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston developed. Here you can see the trio of Bostonians with Okakura. So you can see Morse, Fenelosa, Bigelow, and Okakura. It was the Centennial Exposition in 1876 in Philadelphia that first exposed Americans to Japanese art. And some of the first Korean works to enter the MFA were Buddhist paintings, which were in fact collected in Japan between 1878 and 1889 by Bigelow and Fenelosa, who were both Buddhist devotees. They became converts to Buddhism. And these paintings had been taken to Japan at some point during, at some point before that, and preserved for many hundreds of years in Buddhist temples in Japan. Bigelow and Fenelosa went to Japan at the suggestion and encouragement of Edward Sylvester Morse. He was a zoologist from Salem, and he first went there in 1877 to collect brachiopods. Just take this out. And this is Edward Sylvester Morse. He was offered a position at the University of Tokyo, and he remained there for more than 2 years, during which time he carried out the first archaeological excavations in Japan. I'm sure a lot of you know all about Morse because he's very well known, and he wrote a book, Japan Day by Day. And in that book, he describes meeting the Korean exiles, Yun Ji-ho, and his father, Yun Ong-ryol, who had fled to Japan after the failed military revolt in 1882. Morse developed an interest in pottery, as you can see from this slide, which actually shows one of the display cases in the MFA where his Korean collection was displayed in early times. His collection of more than 5,000 pieces of ceramics were predominantly Japanese teawares, and it was eventually purchased by the MFA in 1892. Morse, as you know, became the director of what's now the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, and I expect you also know that that Yu Gil-jun lodged with him in Salem and donated his costume collection to the Peabody Essex Museum. But Morse was appointed keeper of ceramics at the MFA in 1892, and he worked on writing a catalogue of his collection, which was eventually published in 1901. And this photograph is taken from that catalogue. And amongst his collection was this group of 112 early Korean ceramics. I think you can see from this picture that they're not all of the highest quality. A lot of them are tombwares, and there are some celadons. Some of them he acquired from Pierre-Louis Jouy. His dates were he died in 1894. And Jouy was another zoologist with whom Morse was in touch, and he acquired pottery around Busan, Chemulpo, which is, of course, present-day Incheon, and Seoul between 1881 and 1886. Some of Morse's friends established the Edward Sylvester Morse Memorial Fund after his death in 1925, and this was used to buy some more Korean ceramics. Morse wrote at the beginning of the catalogue of his collection that a small collection of Korean pottery has been brought together to show in a measure what the Japanese really owe to Korea, which is good. It's true. However, he also wrote rather negatively, perhaps reflecting the sort of narrow-mindedness of that time anyway. He said, "It is to China that the Japanese, as well as all other nations, are indebted for many of the methods of work and styles of decoration in porcelain and pottery. Indeed, the more one studies authentic specimens of Korean pottery, the more impressed he becomes that Korea gave to Japan nothing beyond a number of industrious potters who in early centuries brought the lathe-turned mortuary pottery and later the Mishima decoration, which the Japanese rapidly converted into a highly artistic form." Well, this rather negative statement, I think, just reflects the sort of ignorance of Westerners about Korea's illustrious ceramic tradition at the time. And that's also reflected in Stephen Bushell's comments in England when he wrote about Korean ceramics, and he said much the same, but they just didn't know at that time. So this is another piece from the Morse collection, which he bought from Dewey, and it's rather a wonderful piece that hasn't been on display for many years. It was actually in storage off-site, and we got it back to the museum, and one of our conservators, Leanne Gordon, spent a lot of time taking it apart and sticking it together again because it was all broken. And I think she's done a great job. It's one of those shamanistic pre-Buddhist burial wares with the high-footed stand, rather dramatic. So it's now on display in the Korean gallery. It's the sort of high-fired stoneware, which that technique was transported from Korea to Japan. So actually Morse was wrong in that we know now that the tradition of high-fired stoneware was taken from Korea to Japan in the Three Kingdoms period. So the next important donor to the MFA's collection was Bigelow. And 31 pieces of Korean art came to the MFA through Bigelow, who collected them during the 7 years he spent in Japan. These include fine paintings, metalwork, ceramics, and lacquer. Whether he knew that they were all Korean when he collected them is uncertain, but MFA curators thought at least some of them were Chinese or Japanese when they accessioned them. Bigelow was the son and grandson of famous Bostonian surgeons, and he was educated at Harvard Medical School in the class of 1871. But he abandoned medicine for Japan, where he lived from 1882 to 1889. His interests were wide-ranging, and his funds were pretty unlimited. His family's wealth allowed him to amass over 40,000 works, all of which were donated to the MFA when he became a trustee in 1891. And some of the most important Korean works donated by him are this 14th century Perfect Enlightenment Sutra, which is a Koryo Dynasty, one of 3 Koryo Dynasty Buddhist paintings in the MFA's collection. Also, this painting, which is of a falcon, and which, when it came into the museum, is an example of one of the pieces that was thought to be Chinese. And it's for many years been catalogued as Chinese 14th century. But as a result of the Jeong, the National Institute for Cultural Properties survey, which was done in 2003 in the MFA, it was reattributed to E. Am on the basis of the seals, some of the seals on the painting. E. Am, of course, being a famous 16th century painter from the royal family, the E family. And this was a painting that we lent to the exhibition at the Met, which many of you may have seen, Korea's Renaissance. And it even featured in the New York Times. So that's thanks to Bigelow. And this early 15th century painting in Angyeon style is another example of something which Bigelow collected in Japan. You can see the Japanese style mount. And this is one very important lacquer sutra box from the Koryo dynasty, inlaid with mother of pearl. I expect some of you know that there are only 8 lacquer sutra boxes dating from the Koryo dynasty in existence anymore. There's one here in Boston, and there's one in London in the British Museum. There's one in the Rijksmuseum Amsterdam, and the rest are all in Japanese collections. There are only about 15 examples of Koryo Dynasty inlaid mother of pearl anything, inlaid mother of pearl with lacquer pieces. So the MFA is lucky to have 2. So this box is very important, and it also shows the sort of unity of style, the inlay decoration, the stylized chrysanthemums being very similar to the sort of inlay you see on Sangam inlay on celadons. Another example of a Choson dynasty Buddhist painting, which was donated by Bigelow, which is also to be seen at the moment at the MFA in an exhibition of Choson dynasty Buddhist paintings in the Asian Paintings Gallery next to the Korean Gallery. So Bigelow, after his death, was wrapped in a cloak with a Buddhist rosary he'd used, and half of his ashes were sent to Japan to be buried at a temple at Otsu, along with those of Fenelosa, with whom he'd lived there. And the other half of his ashes are buried in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at his family grave in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. So it's a kind of symbol of the way that Bigelow was able to unite Japan and Boston. And then Fenelosa, he was born in Salem. He was the son of a Spanish musician. And although he worked as a professor of philosophy and political economy at the University of Tokyo, he became passionately interested in art, particularly Buddhist paintings. And Fenelosa's book, Epochs of Chinese and Japanese Art, which was published in 1913 after his death, was a groundbreaking history of East Asian art on the Western art historical model. In it, he makes reference to the high quality of early Korean Buddhist art. He was particularly interested in Buddhist paintings, and most of what he collected were in fact Buddhist paintings. And he's much more positive than Morse about the debt which Japan owed to Korea. Fenelosa's collection, which was purchased, Fenelosa was not wealthy, not like Bigelow, and his collection was purchased and it was donated to the MFA by a wealthy Bostonian physician who was called Charles Goddard Welt, who also travelled in the Far East. So the collection is now called the Fenelosa Weld Collection. Fenelosa became the curator of the MFA's Asian collection in the early 20th century. But, I mean, I don't know if you know, there was a sort of scandal attached to Fenelosa, and he sort of eloped with the department assistant. And so he got divorced, and he and his second wife, who he married, went back to Japan. He sort of had to leave the MFA, and so he went back to Japan. I mean, I guess that sort of thing wouldn't really be so important today, but at the time it was quite a big scandal anyway. But it was his second wife who in fact ended up seeing through the publication of his book in 1913 after his death. So 21 of the works in the Fenelosa Weld collection are Korean, and they include this wonderful Koryo painting, The Descent of Tejaprabha Buddha. But Bigelow and Fenelosa could not have been so successful in Japan without the aid of their Japanese friend, translator, connoisseur, and advisor Okukura Kakuzo, with whom they travelled widely around Japan. He was originally one of Fenelosa's students, but he later became advisor, and then he became curator. When Fenelosa left and went back to Japan, Okukura came to the MFA and became curator there from 1904 to 1913. He was an author as well. He wrote Ideals of the East and the Book of Tea, and he was well known for being seen around Boston in his traditional Japanese costumes, and he was an eloquent spokesman who could translate the ways of Asia for a Bostonian audience. which included, of course, the collector, the rich American lady collector Isabella Stewart Gardner, who opened her own museum in Boston. And he used to go and do the tea ceremony for her in her Venetian palazzo on the Fenway. Okakura established a special Korean pottery fund at the MFA, through which he purchased Korean celadons and bronze mirrors. And he had immaculate taste. And one of the most important works in the Korean collection belonged to Okakura personally. And that's this exceptional 8th century gilt bronze medicine Buddha, which was donated after his death to the MFA by Edward Jackson Holmes, who was the president of the museum. You can see that it's a characteristically unified Shilla piece. It has a flat face, it has the octagonal base with the open work in it, and the rather sort of chunky lotus flower, which is Korean style. And here you can see he has the medicine pot in his left hand. It's a really very rare and very beautiful piece. It comes probably from a temple in North Korea, from a set which was dispersed. And then Henry Adams, of course, from the famous Adams family from Boston, he also travelled in Japan, and the heirs of Henry Adams donated this wonderful Buddhist painting in 1919. And it's an early Choson Dynasty Buddhist painting with an inscription by the Dowager Queen Jeong. And it's an example of how it's also the medicine Buddha, and it's an example of how this sort of Koryo style, beautiful decorative silk painting that carried on through into the early Choson dynasty. And it's also an example of how, although in the Choson dynasty Confucianism became the official philosophy, Buddhism was still practiced, especially by the royal family and by women. So this is a really beautiful example of early Choson dynasty Buddhist painting, which we also lent to the Met for their exhibition about the early Choson. Another major donor to the MFA's Korean collection was Denman Waldo Ross, 1853 to 1935. Ross was actually one of the biggest donors to the MFA in all areas. He was a voracious collector of all materials, all countries, and he was famous for having said that he felt that a piece of porcelain or a sculpture was just as important as a high-quality painting, and that there shouldn't be a hierarchy of materials. He graduated from Harvard with high honours in 1875, and he subsequently taught the theory of design at Harvard. He was an influential figure in the development of art theory, and he was one of the major and most wide-ranging donors to the MFA. He served as a trustee for over 40 years, from 1895 to 1934, and he donated 39 Korean pieces, some jointly with Bigelow. And these include 2 fine Choson Dynasty King of Hell paintings. Here you can see one of them, and you can see, I think, some of the you can see the way that the King of Hell is dressed like a sort of official, and at the bottom you can see some of the punishments that are being meted out to people. Here you can see some poor sinner who's being sawn in half. Do you see here? And these people here have got kind of yokes around their necks so that they can't reach their mouth, so they can't eat, so they'll starve to death. And this chap here is being pulled along by his hair. And then here on the bottom right, you can see Shittigaba, the Jijang Posal, who tries to intercede for deceased souls. So this is a very interesting example of a Choson Dynasty painting of a King of Hell. He also donated this Buddhist portrait painting. This is a portrait of the monk, the warrior monk, Samyongdang. You probably know him. He's very famous because he was the patriot who helped to defend Korea from the Japanese invasion. And this is a beautiful painting of a priest seated on a chair. He's got his feet tucked up underneath him as if he was sitting on the floor under his robe. And you can see his empty shoes on the footstand at the bottom. And you can also see his robe, which is a sort of patchwork robe, which is like priests should wear, patchwork robes. It's one of the 3 Buddhist priest portraits we have, and it's the best one. And then this is a piece of puncheong ware, which was donated by Denman Waldo Ross and William Sturgis Bigelow, one of the joint donations. And I put it in particularly because you can see what it was like when it was first donated here. And this is what it's like now, having had conservation treatment. Pam Hatchfield, who's the head of our 3D conservation department, objects conservation, she cleaned it with sort of swabs of, she kind of coated it with swabs, water. It was mainly water, but she left it coated with cloth soaked in water, and it absorbed all the dirt. And also she made this wonderful new neck here for it, because you can see here it's broken. And it's an example of the 2 fish motif, which is, as you may know, is a pun on the word for fish, which is the same sound as the word for plenty. So this is a rather beautiful example of puncheong ware. Now, Hervey Wetzel was a student of Denman Waldo Ross and a sort of companion of his. He was a graduate of the Harvard class of 1911. He was a man of considerable wealth, and he went to France with the Red Cross during the First World War, where he died of pneumonia. And in 1919, this pair of Shilla earrings was donated from his collection. It was no doubt originally from one of the Shilla tombs in the Gyeongju area. And you can see this is the earliest example of Shilla earrings that we have, but we do have some other examples of Shilla gold as well. And this piece was also from the Hervey Wetzel collection, and it was donated in 1919 as well. And it's a beautiful example of celadon from the Koryo period. It's either an incense burner or a planter for plants, and it's got beautiful moulded decoration on the side. And the legs, you can see here, seem to recall wood carving. It would, of course, be an example of a celadon which is copying the archaistic bronzes of the Sung dynasty in China, which are in turn copying the ancient bronzes. Now, Tomita Kojiro succeeded Okakura as curator at the MFA. And Korean works continued to be acquired under Tomita Kojiro. This is an example of one of the Korean Buddhist paintings, a beautiful water moon Guanyin from the Choson dynasty. This is also in the Choson Dynasty Buddhist Paintings exhibition, which you can see at the MFA until June this year. 2 very extraordinary pieces of Koryo metalwork were acquired by Tomita. Both of them came from Yamanaka and Company, which had offices in Boston as well as New York, Paris, and London. In 1935, the MFA purchased this gilt silver wine ewer and warming basin. You can see that it's surmounted by a phoenix here, and these are lotus flowers here. It's surely a royal piece because of the phoenix, which is a symbol of the Queen. It was lent to the National Museum of Korea in 2009 for its centennial exhibition. And it's actually just gone back to Korea, having been installed in our gallery as a centrepiece. Just as the gallery was opened, we got a request from the Liam Museum to lend it to an exhibition which they're doing on treasure, on gold and silver. And they made such a good case for including this in their exhibition. And we, of course, wanted to show it because it's such a it's a unique example of Goryeo Dynasty metalwork, which, if it were in Korea, would be a national treasure. So we're very lucky to have it. And you can see that it's in the shape of stalks of bamboo. This is the warming basin, and you'd have put the ewer inside the basin, and the basin would have been filled with hot water. And this ewer just fits inside here very tightly. And then the spout is in the shape of a stalk of bamboo, a shoot of bamboo, and the handle has also got notches of bamboo decoration on it. This phoenix, it's interesting the way it's made. The phoenix is actually on a sort of pole that goes all the way down into the centre, down here, and it sticks in, and you can take it out. And then the two lotuses come apart too. So this is all like a sort of edifice stuck on top of the ewer. Of course, there are examples of celadon ewers in this shape, with the lotus and phoenix on the top. There's one in the National Museum of Korea. So it shows that celadons were very much influenced by the metalwork shapes. So that's one of our two very extraordinary pieces of Goryeo Dynasty metalwork. And the other one is this silver gilt Buddhist reliquary, which was acquired in 1939, also from Yamanaka. This is in the shape of a Buddhist stupa, which is sitting on a lotus flower here. And in fact, this is the lid. So you lift off the stupa, and the lotus flower is the base. And these 5 little containers all fit round in a circle, and they fit on top of the lotus flower underneath this lid. So we've taken them out here for the photograph. And inside each of these little containers are some relics, some of which still remain. But I have to emphasize that they're not real relics, they're symbolic relics. So in fact, inside one of these containers is a glass bead, and inside another one is a bronze bead. And we've tested these in our research lab, so we know that that's what they're made of. But they're the symbolic remains of 2 Goryeo Dynasty Buddhist monks, Naong and Jeong. And it's thought that this reliquary comes from the Hwayamsa Temple, which is now a ruin outside Seoul. But the Hwayamsa Temple Museum is trying to reconstruct the temple. And the museum did, in fact, ask if they could borrow this reliquary. But we decided that instead of lending the reliquary to Korea, we would make a replica. We would not make we would make a scan, and we donated the scan free of charge to the Hwayamsa Temple Museum, where they can make a replica based on the scan. It's a 3D scan, which has all the, it's done to size, so it has all the right dimensions so that they could produce a replica. It's a very interesting reliquary because it's in the shape of a stupa, and it shows the sort of influence of the Mongol architecture, the Chinese and Mongol architecture on the Lake Goryeo, when, of course, there was a lot of intermarriage between the Mongol royal family and the Korean queens. So you've probably read in the newspapers about this, so it's not a secret. We did receive a request for it to be repatriated to Korea from a Buddhist monk called Hyemun, who represents an organization which is trying to repatriate works of art to Korea, particularly from Japan. And we had discussions with the Korean government, with the Munhajaechong, the Korean Cultural Heritage Administration, There was some discussion about, because they asked if we would return the whole of this reliquary because of the importance of the symbolic remains inside of the Buddhist monks. We decided that we felt that we had to keep the relics together with the actual reliquary, and we asked for advice from the National Research Institute of Cultural Properties, from the head of the Cultural Heritage Administration, who recommended that the reliquary be kept together with the relics, as we had also thought. So we decided to keep it all together in the MFA, where it's on display for anybody to see. And the Buddhist monk Hyemun and his organisation have come to pay their respects since the gallery has been renovated. So that's the story of the claim to this reliquary. Of course, there's absolutely no legal claim to it because we acquired it in 1939, so the MFA has title to it. And the government of Korea made it clear that they were not officially requesting back this piece. It was Hyemun and the Buddhist organization which made the request, just to make it clear. Okay, so the next great collection of Korean art came to the MFA in 1950 as a bequest from Charles Bain Hoyt. And it consists mainly of ceramics, but also includes some metalwork and lacquer. And he also collected fine Chinese ceramics, particularly of the Song Dynasty. Hoyt inherited his wealth from the Bain Wagon Company, the railroad, which allowed him to spend his life collecting and studying Asian art. And he acquired the foundation of his great Korean collection in Paris, where it had been brought from Korea during World War I. He was actually an honorary curator at the Fogg Museum in Harvard, and a close friend of the art historian Langdon Warner. But he decided, luckily for us, to leave his collection to the MFA, and also to establish a purchase fund, quite a generous purchase fund, an endowed fund, from which the museum continues to benefit. So some of the more recent acquisitions have been purchased using the Hoyt Fund. Hoyt became a member of the visiting committee of the Department of Asiatic Art in the 1940s, and his first gift was this flower-shaped Koryo Dynasty flower-shaped lacquer box inlaid with mother of pearl and with painted tortoise shell, which is unusual. And it was originally thought to be Chinese. It's the only such box in this shape in existence, and it was most probably for storing a Buddhist rosary necklace, although early on some scholars suggested that these shaped boxes were for cosmetics, but more recent research seems to suggest that they were for Buddhist use. The Hoyt collection of nearly 300 pieces has remained relatively unknown outside specialist circles, partly because of the restriction he made, stipulating that it should not be lent anywhere. This is similar to the stipulation made by Demon Waldo Ross, that his collection should not be lent anywhere. And also, in fact, Bigelow made the same restriction on his collection, because in that period, in the early to mid-20th century, a lot of collectors seemed to think that lending things was dangerous, and so people should come to Boston to see these works of art. It has somewhat limited, the interaction and the way that we can lend these works. So I personally would welcome being able to lend the Hoyt collection to different places, because there's a limit to how much we can actually display in the Korean gallery. And it seems a pity to me that we can't lend those other pieces to other museums or show some of it back in Korea even. And there would be interest in that, I think. With the Bigelow collection, we've actually been able to change the restriction, because the wording said something like, he felt that transporting works of art on horse-drawn carriage would be dangerous for the works of art. So, since we don't do that anymore, it's legally, we're okay in changing that stipulation. But with Hoyt, we haven't been able to. So that's why we can't lend it anywhere, unfortunately. So we couldn't lend any of them to the exhibition in Korea last year of Korean art from American collections. But the quality of the celadons in the Hoyt collection is unparalleled in the United States, and perhaps only rivaled in the West by the Gompertz collection at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England, and of course in Japan by the Ataka collection in the Osaka Museum of Far Eastern Ceramics. This is a wonderful bamboo shoot-shaped ewer. There's a similar one in the National Museum of Korea, beautifully modelled, showing that Korean love of vegetable and fruit shapes, natural forms. And this is a Mabyong with inlaid birds and willow, and it's really a unique design, very painterly design, looks a bit like bird and flower painting. And then this is some examples of the ceramics in the Hoyt collection that are not celadons. We have this wonderful moon jar and blue and white pieces. This actually has been cleaned. This is a before rather than an after photograph, I'm afraid. So since it's been cleaned by conservation, it looks much whiter than this. You can see all the dirt in the cracks, but a beautiful underglazed cobalt blue phoenix. And then this is underglaze iron brown with a very, very schematic dragon. It actually is so schematic, it hasn't got a head, this dragon. But an example of, the wonderful Korean sort of vigorous painting on ceramics. So whether Hoyt and Gompertz, who were the two great transatlantic collectors of superb Corioceladons, actually knew each other personally is unknown, to me at least. But Gompertz definitely knew and appreciated the Hoyt collection when he wrote his 1963 groundbreaking study, Korean Celadon of the Koryo and Other Wares of the Koryo Dynasty, because he included several pieces from the Hoyt collection as illustrations in that book. And this is another example of the Hoyt collection, a peach-shaped water dropper showing underglaze blue and underglaze red. And also he collected paintings. This Amitabha Buddha painting is in our Choson Dynasty Buddhist Paintings exhibition. And we did some research on the colours in this painting, thanks to a 3-month internship from the Korea Foundation. We had a conservator who came and did some analysis of pigments, and we found that the yellow colour on this painting is not gold as we thought, but it's orpiment, which is quite interesting. So the next donor, Robert Treat Payne, 1900 to 1965, was the son of a major donor of European art to the museum. And he actually became curator of the Asiatic department after Tomita's retirement. But unfortunately, he died early in 1965. But in 1960, he donated this unusual silver belt ornament. And this painting also came in 1963 by Jeong. And in more recent years, Jan Fontaine, the great Asian art scholar who worked at the MFA from 1968 to 1967 and became director in 1976, acquired 253 works of Korean art and archaeology for the museum. And here are some of the works which were acquired during his time at the museum, mostly archaeological pieces. This is a rather beautiful needle container and spool inside, a Koryo Dynasty for ladies. He also organised the Travelling Loan exhibition from Korea, entitled 5,000 Years of Korean Art in 1980, and he opened the first Korean gallery in 1982, celebrating the 100th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Korea and the United States, which, if you remember, were established in 1882. So he opened the first gallery in 1982, and we renovated it 30 years later in 2012. So it was timely. So the MFA continues to collect Korean art through purchase and donation in order to keep the collection abreast of the times and to reflect present-day Korea as well as yesterday's Korea. This is an example of a screen that was purchased actually from Maria Henderson. Now, she's, of course, the wife of Gregory Henderson, the well-known diplomat who unfortunately died early, but his collection is now in Harvard Art Museum, and his collection is particularly strong in Three Kingdoms ceramics. And he did, in fact, donate 1 or 2 Three Kingdoms ceramics to the MFA's collection too. But this was purchased from Maria Henderson after his death. And it's one of those collage type screens which are rather unusual, with different calligraphies and paintings, which look as if they're stuck on, but in fact they're painted on. Probably influenced by China, from the Bapo paintings tradition in China. So in the last 4 years, actually 4.5 years since I've been at the MFA, we've acquired 20 Korean works. Most of these are either Choson Dynasty screens or contemporary Korean ceramics and art. So here you can see some examples of the Choson Dynasty screens that we've acquired in the last few years, some of them from some of you sitting in this room. So this is a Chekori screen, books and things, books and scholars' objects screen. And I've been trying to acquire screens for one example of the different types of screens that were made in the Choson dynasty. And we have one case in the gallery, which is for a screen. At the moment, we have a wonderful 18th century Chekori screen on loan from a local private collector. But when that goes back after 9 months, we'll show another screen, one of these. And we've now acquired enough so that we can rotate them. And there'll always be a different screen to see in the gallery. So here you can see an example of the Lotus and Fish screen. Keith MacLeod, the Keith MacLeod Fund. Keith MacLeod was another of the donors in the early 20th century who gave us an endowed purchase fund from which we still benefit. And here you can see we use the Charles Bain Hoyt Fund to acquire this lovely grapevine screen, dragon in the shape of a dragon. And here is a Munjado screen, you know, the 8 characters, Chinese characters for Confucian virtues, which are decorated with birds and fish. And very beautiful, almost Art Deco looking, I think. And this is a beautiful bird and flower screen in courtly style. Again, from the Hoyt Fund. This is another more recent acquisition, an album by Yang Ki-hun, which is on display, will be on display in the second rotation in the gallery. And here we have a pojagi, which was donated by Mrs. Kang. We only have 2 pojagi in our collection at the moment, unfortunately. The textiles all sit in another department, and we don't have any Korean costume, and only 2 pojagi. So we're looking to acquire more textiles in the future and more costumes if we can. So the Korean contemporary ceramics which we've acquired are, you can see when you first go into the gallery, and we've tried to put them in a place where they sort of attract the attention of the viewer as you go into the gallery, and where you can see how they engage with the traditional ceramics. So this piece by Cho Jong-hyun from Ewha University was actually made at the Harvard Ceramics Center when she was on a sabbatical in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it was donated, as you can see, by Nami Kim Wagner, Professor Wagner's widow, who is also a potter herself and is a friend of Professor Cho. So we're very lucky to have it. And Professor Cho responds to those Three Kingdom sculptural sort of tomb wares as well as to ongi wares. And you can see the open work, the pierced decoration and the inlaid decoration are looking back to traditional wares. So it's good to have it in a gallery to kind of surprise people and show how she's engaging with tradition. And the same with Kim In-young, who responds to Choson Dynasty porcelain Confucian ritual wares, which would have originally been based on bronzes. And the flanges here you can see, which would have originally reflected the flanges of molten bronze escaping from the ceramic piece moulds. This was donated by Frank Bailey, one of our visiting committee members, who's also a well-known collector of Korean ceramics. And then this piece by Lee Soo-kyung, she's a younger generation of ceramic artists. She actually trained in sculpture, and she collects shards from potters in the Icheon area around Seoul. And she works in blue and white porcelain and in celadons, and she puts them together with this sort of gold lacquer decoration, which she says is a pun on the word kum, gold, which also means a break. Some people like to see it looking like a bit like the repairs that you see on old celadons that are done in gold lacquer. I like to think of it as green, because she recycles the celadons, and so they're green celadons, but they're green because they're recycled. And that talks to the contemporary sort of movement towards recycling in contemporary works of art. And then Yongjae Lee, she's a potter who lives in Germany but is Korean. And this is an interesting response to the Korean moon jars. And you can see a kind of German aesthetic, a kind of Bauhaus style aesthetic in this, with the angular the angular profile here, which reflects the Bauhaus aesthetic, I think. So I like the idea that it's kind of east-west, cross-cultural links. And then we have this piece on display in our Choson Dynasty Buddhist Paintings show. We also included Kang Ik-jeong's Happy Buddha, again, a donation from Mrs. Kang, for which we're very grateful. And we wanted to show that 20% of the Korean population, the South Korean population, is still Buddhist. And we also wanted to show contemporary responses to Buddhism. And as you know, Kang Ik-jeong lives in New York and has been exhibited at the Met, and we're delighted to have an example of his work in the MFA. And we also wanted to include one North Korean piece. This is a propaganda poster. It's the only North Korean piece in our MFA collection at the moment, but I think it's important to have a record for future generations of the present regime in that half of the Korean peninsula. Let's follow the spirit of the great general. Let's enter a new phase in coal production. This is actually a promised gift of my husband, who acquired it in North Korea when he was there. And it's not even in the MFA at the moment, but it's still in England. And as you probably know, there's an embargo on importing works of art from North Korea. So we're not allowed to import it at the moment. So it's still in England, but it is a promised gift. If I have anything to do with it anyway. So this is a plan of the gallery. And you can see that when you come in, this is the contemporary ceramics here with the Lee Soo-kyung in the middle. So the idea is that because it's right in the corner of the museum, you can look through here and it might draw you in to the gallery. And then the early Korea here is here, the Three Kingdoms period. And this whole section here is Koryo dynasty. This side is Buddhism. And this side is secular. And then in the middle are the highlights. Actually, that's a Choson Dynasty painting, but we put it there because it's all about Buddhism. And it shows some link with the Koryo Dynasty paintings. And then this section here is Choson Dynasty. And this is the screen case, which has the Chekori screen at the moment, the trompe-l'oeil type screen. And then in the future, we'll put the other screens that we've acquired there. This is puncheong, this is porcelain, and this is paintings cases here. So we'll always have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paintings which will rotate regularly. So there'll always be something new to see in the gallery. And here there's actually a touch screen which where we put different potters doing different things like the inlay technique. There's one potter doing sangam inlay. There's another one making a moon jar and firing and preparing the clay. So because ceramics is such an important part of the Korean cultural history, we thought it was important to show people how it was done. This is a picture of the Korean gallery as it is in its newly renovated state. Here you can see the ewer in the middle, which is actually not there at this minute because it's in Korea. And that's the touch screen. And that's the trompe-l'œil chequerie screen, the one which is probably a royal piece. And then you can see the moon jar there, and two of our most wonderful Jeong here, the Koryo painting and the Choson painting. And that's the reliquary, and that's the medicine Buddha. And then one more picture of the gallery with people in it from the other end. So you can see this is the early Korean section with the Three Kingdoms wares. So thanks to the Korea Foundation and thanks to the generosity of some of you in this room, we're able now to open a renovated and redesigned Korean gallery, which will enable our new generations to see and appreciate the beauty of Korean art, both past and present, and the efforts of those early scholars, travellers and collectors from Boston. So do come and see it. Thank you. Anybody? Yeah. And also, I'd like to just say that there is a book, Arts of Korea, 100 highlights. So it's only got 100 of our collection. Our collection has about 1,000 items in it, but we can only show 100 in this book. But it is some of the highlights. And a lot of these are on display in the gallery. We have an introduction in it about the history of the collection. So does anybody have any questions? Yes.
In the Choson Dynasty Buddhist painting, you said that after the conservators came from Korea for analysis,
yeah,
you said that what you thought was gold was another pigment.
Orpiment. O-R-P-I-M-E-N-T. Now, don't ask me what it is. I'm not a chemist, but it's a yellow pigment that's been identified. Yeah, and we have the Korea Foundation have been giving us an intern every year for 3 months as part of the global internship program that the Korea Foundation have. We got funding from the Korea Foundation to renovate our gallery, and as part of the agreement, we agreed to take an intern for 3 months, September, October, November, and we've done it for 2 years running. And the second one was a conservator, so she came and worked with our research lab and conservation department for 3 months last autumn. Yeah.
Just for that particular Choson Buddhist painting?
She worked on Choson Dynasty Buddhist paintings because that's what we were working on, and she did some research on several of the paintings, actually. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Where is the book available in New York?
Well, I saw it today in the Met's bookshop, so you can get it there, but I don't know where else. It's also available online, of course. MFA Publications. You can get it on Amazon. Yes.
I'm wondering, I mean, it's really interesting in terms of looking at the chronology of the transmission. The transmission of design ideas, China, Korea, Japan, but also you've got these collectors who pulled things from those multiple cultures. Do you address that in some way in the installation?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
The connection. I mean, I think one of the things that's rare about the MFA is that you actually have strengths in particularly Japanese and Korean, but also it was certain, I mean, mostly these Boston collectors are seen as Anglo-Japanese guys. They're not seen as Anglo-Korean guys.
Yes, yeah.
So I guess I'm asking if you in some way make that connection, which is historical, I mean, in terms of transmissions from Korea to Japan, but also in terms of the collecting of the material you have.
Well, in the gallery, we have one of those photographs of Percival Lowell and the first, diplomatic delegation, which comes from Korea via Japan with Lowell. We also have the Okakura sculpture where we talk a bit about him. And in the space next to the Korean gallery, we have the Choson Dynasty Buddhist paintings where I talk a little about the way that, it's a kind of paradox that they were collected actually, that we're lucky that it's because of the fact that they were collected by those Buddhists from Boston who were interested in Japanese Buddhist art that we end up getting Korean Buddhist paintings. We haven't specifically addressed the sort of art historical links between Japanese, Chinese and Buddhist art, but that would be something that would be a wonderful subject for a temporary exhibition. But that's quite a big subject. So actually, one of the things we have done, which is very interesting, is we've been doing gradual research into the collection with the help of various visiting scholars. And just recently, we've identified another work of art which was originally catalogued as Chinese, which we think is Korean. So there was the landscape painting, the falcon painting, some of the Buddhist paintings, and now we've just also discovered a Sutra Manuscript, which is the frontispiece from a Koryo Dynasty, a gold-painted Sutra Manuscript, which is actually mounted as a hanging scroll. And I'm pretty sure it's actually Koryo Dynasty. And it was identified with the help of Professor Insu Cho, who came as a visiting fellow to Harvard. So we're working on that sort of thing. But actually, what's the word? It's a bit like archaeology in our collection. Gradually, there's so many things in our collection that we're still researching that I'm sure we'll find more in the future. And it would be wonderful to try and do some sort of exhibition about that in the future. But so far, I've only managed to do the Korean gallery. So.
Good job.
Okay. Anyone else?
Thank you for your presentation today. I think art assessment is very important. So do you have any educational program related to Korean art exhibition?
Yes, we did. In fact, we've been doing a lecture series, a course on Korean art, which has been going on through January, February, March. Bob Mowry actually took part in it, and I also lectured on it. And that was a public program. We also had a Korea Foundation Day when we had the opening of the gallery, and we had Jeong came up and gave an artist talk. We hope to do that sort of thing on an annual basis. Yes.
Well, I'm not sure, but I thought I saw a tiger.
A tiger.
Picture of the tiger in MFA a few years ago.
We don't have a tiger painting, as far as I know. I wish we did have a tiger painting, but we don't.
Somewhere. Thank you.
Maybe somebody can find us one. Anyone else? Okay.
Baseball opportunity.